Hopefully the email went out that tonight's talk is about retreat or resist, Dharma in the age of Trump. Otherwise, if some people are expecting a really calm, placid Dharma talk about the 7 factors of enlightenment, you're gonna be surprised, maybe pleasantly. But what I want to talk about is a little bit about the intersections of, as it so happens, my 2 careers, but I think it's also the intersections of our personal and our public lives, our political and our spiritual lives. So in order to do that, I have to start with a joke. And normally, since coming from I sort of have a Jewish tradition, a Buddhist tradition, an earth-based tradition. I got a lot of material, mostly Jewish jokes, but this one's a fake Jewish joke. Because it's from Fiddler on the Roof. So you may remember that a number of the Hasidim are asking the rabbi, is there a blessing for the Tsar, right? The Tsar of Russia who was busy oppressing the Jews and leading pogroms and all those kinds of things. It's like saying, is there a blessing for Hitler, or maybe blessing for the president? And so the rabbi thinks for a minute, because there's a blessing for everything in the Jewish tradition, and I'm sure some of you know, all of you show queens out there, you could probably say it with me. May God bless and keep the Tsar far away from us. And I think that ambivalence probably extends a lot to what it's like to be a meditation practitioner or a spiritual person in our current moment, right? We want to cultivate toward loving kindness and compassion toward all beings except one. But of course, it's not just one. If it was just one, it wouldn't be a problem. That we want to have a way of approaching the world that cultivates and spreads more love. And yet, how do you do that in the face of white supremacy and encroaching fascism and environmental catastrophe and all of the rest? How do we do that without being obscene? Right after the election results, which for most people were a surprise, I'm sorry to say I predicted the election result. I predicted Brexit, and I predicted the election result. So don't listen to any pessimistic predictions that I make, because they might come true. Right after that, a lot of Buddhist teachers were asked, what do we do? Right? A lot of us asked ourselves that. And in the Dharma community in particular, do we change our practice? Is it still okay to take time, if we think about our meditation practice as self-healing, is it even okay to do that? And what does that look like, especially for privileged folks like me, to be taking care of me when there are people who are in so much precariousness, so much danger? And what does that actually look like? And there were a lot of opinions kind of back and forth. And I wrote a piece called Retreat or Fight, Both Are Right. And that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit this evening. And what we're going to do is I'll talk for a little while. If you have the schedule, we're not going to do the small group piece, but we will have kind of extra time for group Q&A. I'd love to hear some of your experiences with this polarity of how we navigate, on the one hand, our ethical and political commitments to being engaged and working toward justice, and on the other hand, our contemplative commitments to ourselves and to our communities. So I'll spend a little bit of time on a couple of kind of principles, and then a little bit more time on 4 practices for the kind of the Trump era. So one thing that people like to do in any community is grab authority and say, well, this is what Buddhism says about X, or this is what the UU Charter says about Y. And there's that kind of sense of like the right answer is out there somewhere if we can just find someone dead enough who said it. And in the Buddhist world, you'll really find both answers to the question of retreat or resist. You'll find ample historical precedent on both sides. You will find monastic traditions which explicitly say any talk of kings and princes and politics, what we would say politics, is not wholesome talk. It's a waste of speech. It's not right speech. Don't involve yourself with the ephemeral political winds that blow one way and then the other. That's not actually what noble friends and acquaintances do. And there was just as much oppression and injustice in 6th century BCE India as there is now. And it's not as though the monastics of that period couldn't be aware of it. Surely they were. And yet there was a view that spending any of your mental energy, let alone your physical energy, on politics was kind of a waste. You will also find in Buddhist history and text the exact opposite view. Right? They say sometimes 2 Jews, 3 opinions. 2 Buddhists, 16 opinions. So certainly in the last 100 years, the movement of engaged Buddhism, mostly a Western phenomenon, but not entirely. Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnamese monk, most important engaged Buddhist, absolutely has the 180-degree opposite view that not only is politics not a waste of time, but if we don't act out our principles in the political and in the ethical spheres, we're wasting our time and missing the point. And it's not just Thich Nhat Hanh who just invented that, or other people who invented it in the 20th and 21st century. You'll find plenty of precedent for that, where for better or for worse, both liberal and conservative. You'll find in Buddhist history times in which the Buddhist hierarchy supported various corrupt monarchs, supported all kinds of violence and oppression, certainly supported patriarchy, right? In a fully kind of sexist way. You'll also find a lot of really wonderful examples, like Ashoka, the Buddhist emperor, who was very progressive for his time. Long story short, you won't find the answer by looking in a history book as to what Buddhism really has to say, because Buddhism, like any civilization that spans cultures and contexts and millennia and continents, says everything and nothing. In the Western Buddhist community, by which I mean communities like this one and others around it, generally you'll find an engaged and world-affirming and liberal orientation that recoils against the monastic. I even felt it in the room. People hated that first thought of like, we should never talk about politics, right? Partly it's because we tend to be, we in the American Buddhist community, tend to like weird things. Otherwise we wouldn't like, there was a great study recently published about how few conservatives like sushi, right? I mean, I eat sushi at least once a week, right? Who doesn't eat sushi? Who even thinks sushi is weird in 2017? Newsflash, half of America thinks it's weird. Actually, probably about 2/3, but half of those people eat it anyway, and the other half voted for Trump. It's also hard to be, I think, it's hard to have a certain kind of conservatism when you're doing what we did just for the last half hour, looking at yourself, looking at your stuff, seeing your reactions, seeing the consequences that your actions have on others. It's certainly possible to be a compassionate conservative. Those do exist. It wasn't just a myth that Bush made up, mostly a myth, but not entirely a myth. It's possible to fully have compassion in your heart and just have a different opinion from most liberals about how to get from point A to point B, but still have an idea that point B is a world where there's less suffering than point A. But what's impossible, really, is to do authentic practice and not care. Authentic practice and say, well, whatever happens to those people, that outgroup, that other group, the group that's not me, that doesn't matter, and I don't have to pay attention to that. Or the planet, or non-human species, right? Or those other people over there who get bombed, or the other people who I can turn away from my business for being LGBT or Q. That's what's difficult. And so mostly in the Western Buddhist community, you find liberals, right? And we have actually, there's a whole ideology around that too, where we tend to be humanists because most of us, those of us who grew up in a European or an American hegemonic community, humanism's part of our cultural DNA. That this life, you only live once, right? YOLO, the kids say, right? That life is to be cherished, that life is a gift. You'll find plenty of Dharmic teachings that say life is not a gift, and the best thing to do is never get reincarnated again because the wheel of samsara is terrible, right? But you'll also find Buddhist teachings, venerable Buddhist teachings, that say that life is a gift, and Westerners tend to gravitate toward those. So those tend to be and this was a result of smart historical moves, mostly on the part of Burmese, Indian, Thai, and Vietnamese Buddhist practitioners, adapting their teachings first for modernizers in in Asia, and then for some of the Westerners who came to visit. It wasn't actually a Western creation. It was kind of an Asian creation. There's a book by David McMahon, called The Invention of Buddhist Modernism, which is a thick academic book that I found totally fascinating about where all this came to be. But that's going a little bit astray. I think the question is, if this is where we find ourselves in a somewhat Western, somewhat liberal, somewhat engaged, passionate community of spiritual practitioners, what works for us? So there's the search for a usable past, right? Not just whatever past is out there, but what past is usable. Or as I'm giving this talk on Thursday night, as you heard, and I'm basically, the whole talk is just an elaborated interpretation of the Adrian Rich poem, Diving into the Wreck, which if you haven't read, you can read it. You can read it right now, in fact. You can turn your cell phone off of airplane mode and anyway, Adrian Rich, Diving into the Wreck, where she uses the metaphor of like scuba diving into a wreck, what it's like for her as a 20th century lesbian feminist to go into the histories and the traditions, knowing that, in her words, she's reading books in which our names do not appear. Diving into the wreck. It's like the guiding metaphor of my spiritual life. Right? So as we dive into the wreck, what are the treasures that are there among the ship? So I'll just briefly map it on a little bit to like the three main trainings in Theravadan Buddhism, which is what the Vipassana world and a lot of the secular mindfulness world came out of. Is one particular strand. There are plenty of other strands, but this is the one that I practice in and that many of us are familiar with. Those three trainings are samadhi, building calm and concentration, panya, building wisdom, and sila, practicing virtuous action. So I'll look at each of those just really briefly. So for samadhi, right, this is the part of meditation that is being sold right now, right? You can renew, recharge. Have you ever noticed that every time Time magazine writes about meditation, it's some hot-looking white blonde woman sitting in a beautiful skimpy white clothes and everything's really perfectly, right? That's samadhi, right? That's just the good part. That's where you have a good sit, quote unquote, a good sit, and you're really calm and you can get blissed out and you can go on longer and longer retreats. One person here just got back from a 10-day meditation retreat. I love 10-day retreats. One time I did a 5-month meditation retreat. That was great, right? Sort of this wonderful time in my life when I was able to do that. But even over half an hour, you can build a little bit of focus. The mind collects itself, stays on the breath a little bit better. The little dog that is your mind stops running in different directions and actually sits still for a moment. And that collectedness of mind is samadhi, concentration or calm or collectedness of mind. And that's so valuable in an engaged life because those are little islands. It's an oasis where the constant push-pull of what we want, what we don't want, the difficult news, the Facebook feed is on pause. Right? And for those moments, even if it's just in a 20-minute sit, there's a little bit of a break that happens and a recharge that can be a narcissistic cul-de-sac or can energize you to do your work in the world. And it's okay to go to practice for that oasis of rejuvenation. Right? Again, as long as it doesn't become a narcissistic cul-de-sac where we don't do anything and we just bliss out and I feel good and so everything's okay with the universe because it's okay with me. All right, that's the pitfall. But if we're conscious and using those times of rejuvenation to then be able to show up for people who don't have my level, our level of privilege, yeah, that's great. That's a real aid to practice. When the mind is concentrated in this way and calmed in this way, then you can really build insight, panya, P-A-N-N-A. Actually, the N's are enyes. You can see really insight into your stuff. How does suffering manifest in your life? So, like Woody Allen said, life is divided into two parts, the horrible and the miserable. The horrible is like cancer, right? And miserable is like, I had a long time. This morning, my partner spent 45 minutes trying on the phone and the website to reroute a UPS delivery package. That's the miserable, right? It's not horrible. We should be, so what Woody Allen said is, when you're miserable, you should be happy. Because it's not horrible. You can afford to be miserable because nothing's happening that's actually truly horrible. And so whether it's the horrible or the miserable, seeing how that operates, just seeing how the reactive mind does it, moment by moment, breath by breath. I'm sitting on the cushion, on the chair, and a thought comes up, and just I go there. It's a pleasant thought. It's an unpleasant thought, and I go there. You see, moment to moment, that's the sort of the building of wisdom. In the Dharma, right, neuroscience and meditation, right, you're building moments of metacognition at that moment. You're aware of what you're thinking, like what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and the awareness about it. And thanks to the miracle of neuroplasticity, neurons that fire together wire together, meaning you learn. You actually become wiser. You know, like, oh, there's that painful thought. I don't have to grab hold of it and like the dog with the toy. I can actually just coexist with it. Oh, wisdom actually does kind of show up. How does it feel when, we'll get to this in just a moment, when I read a particular story or hear a particular fact or try to get in a particular argument? You can see really clearly anxiety, fear, avoidance. The wonderful spiritual teacher, Joanna Macy, had a whole part of her teaching for about 10, 15 years about why is it that we can't get our heads around climate change? And not just because industries are lying to us and all that kind of stuff. Of course, that's true. But really on a profound level, because we actually can't handle it. And what is it like to sit with the enormity of the tragedy? And she was talking about climate change, but she could be talking about systemic racism. She could be talking about militarism. She could be talking, right? What's it like to sit in the enormity of the catastrophe and not be overwhelmed by it? To have both and. It's human nature to just have a little more avoidance. Just I can't even. Let me change the channel metaphorically. And we can see that happen in our practice and grow wise in that way. And every time that wisdom is building, there's a thing even similar to what Terry said at the end. It's like a little way that a lot of meditators end their practice, that if you sit on your own, I encourage you to take this on, that just having that little thought moment at the end after the bell rings, that may this practice be for the benefit of all beings. That it doesn't end here. That it's not just, I love jacuzzis, right? It's not just a jacuzzi. It's not just feeling good, but gaining wisdom that can hopefully spread out for the benefit of all beings. And how that happens is sila, right? Virtuous action. And that's part 2, some actual practices. How can we put this into practice? And what does all this have to do with the current occupant of the White House, which I haven't said much about and won't. So I have 4 Trump practices that I think you'll enjoy. Some of them are outrageous, and some of them are pretty mellow. I'm curious what you think about them. So written on the little brochures when you came in were some of the precepts, the traditional Buddhist precepts that are taken by meditators, by practitioners. And the 5th one has to do with avoiding intoxicants that lead to heedlessness. So people interpret that precept in different ways. Some people say that means you should never have a drink or a smoke or whatever. And other people say, well, you can have a little bit, but when it leads to heedlessness, right, when you get totally blackout drunk or something like that, or if for whatever reason that's who you are, that just to have one will end up leading to 5, will end up, right, that's where you want to, right, so that's, I think we should think about the internet as an intoxicant that leads to heedlessness, especially the Facebook. And I call it the Facebook because that's what they called it originally. I'm actually friends with one of the founders of Facebook, which is kind of a fun thing to say at a Dharma talk. And he confirms there have now been several articles about this, right? It is designed to be addictive. It's not your fault. I mean, it is, but it's not that you're a bad person, right? The software is designed, right? So just one little example. So I work at the Daily Beast. The new Daily Beast just redid a format change just this past week. And now it's easier, instead of clicking on a new thing to get to a new page, to just keep scrolling down. And there was a study that was done about how many pages people read when they can just keep scrolling down versus if they have to click to go on to the next page. And the number was like 2 to 1. We read twice as much if we just have to just keep scrolling down, as if it doesn't take a lot to click, right? As if, so that's what Facebook is, right? An endless feed, right? And Facebook for me is great, right? It's like the events are great. Keep staying in touch with friends is great. I like the software, but it's an intoxicant that can lead to heedlessness. What would it look like to take on the precept of building the mindfulness of your use of social media, that you can actually notice that moment when, oh, I'm not actually doing those good things anymore about connecting to my friends, and now I'm just getting angry, or now I'm just looking for something to dislike. One of my teachers, Joseph Goldstein, tells a story often about he was driving somewhere on a long distance trip, and they had to stop somewhere, a rest stop, and so they were filling up the car with gas or something, and he went into one of the stores, and he said, "I was looking for something to want." That is my Facebook use in a nutshell. It's like I'm looking for something to want. Sometimes it really is good. Like I actually get really great information that way. And sometimes, it's getting in those really pointless arguments. If you're a Hillary person we're still doing this, right? Still getting in the fight with a Bernie person. If you're a Bernie person and the Hillary person, God help you if you know any Trump people. Like we know that that it doesn't necessarily lead to fruitful, right conversation. So that's just one thought, taking on that precept of looking at intoxicants that can lead to heedlessness. Not stopping, not going cold turkey, not becoming celibate, so to speak, but just toning it down a little bit with mindfulness and compassion to yourself and to others. At what point does becoming an involved, engaged, informed citizen shift into obsessing over every micro detail that's actually just wearing me out? And again, if the buck stopped here, if it was just about me, I don't really care if you privileged people are wearing yourselves out on the computer. I just don't care. And I'm one of those people, right? I don't care if I don't care. But what I do care about is that I have some limited amount of energy, and if I'm wasting it, that's stealing it from the undocumented folks in my neighborhood who could use an ally, from any vulnerable population, from the Muslim folks in my community. I live in Brooklyn in New York. Who could use an ally. Like there are a lot, right? That wasting of energy is stealing of energy. So second possible practice for your consideration, which I actually call Trump practice. And I've tried this, so I can say you can try this at home. So I'll quote a little bit from the Satipatthana Sutta, one of the core Theravadan sutras about mindfulness. So this is the Buddha talking. He says, the meditator understands the consciousness with lust, desire, as with lust. The consciousness without lust, as without lust. The consciousness with hate, as with hate. The consciousness without hate, as without hate. The consciousness with delusion, as with delusion. The consciousness without delusion, as without delusion. And then the Buddha moves on to the next topic. That's mindfulness of emotions, or mindfulness, being aware of your thoughts and of your mind states. Notice what the Buddha says or doesn't say in that passage. Not, I notice the mind has hate in it, and so I immediately change the subject. Not, I notice the mind is filled with desire, so I scold myself for having a desiring mind. What's being suggested is a really subtle way of coexisting with both pleasant and unpleasant emotions. Eckhart Tolle, contemporary spiritual teacher, was on Oprah at one point, and she said, she actually kind of took this from the Jewish tradition, can you summarize your spiritual teaching, in one sentence? And he said, what's going on right now, and can I be with it? So what's going on right now? Just seeing what's up, just like we did. Can I be with it? Not can I change it, that's also part of practice, or not can I go away from it, but can I just actually sit with what's actually happening? So I suggest when you're sitting idly, minding your own business, and a political thought comes in, instead of immediately going back to the breath, use that as an opportunity to do mindfulness of emotions, including mindfulness of Trump. Let him take you over on the cushion. Oh, there's a great person making a really nasty face right in the center. That's what we want. I want a really nasty face. I want you to be sitting there. I don't want you to be like one of those white women on the cover of Time. I want you to be, ugh. I want you to feel it. You let him take over every pore of your being. And if you're on the conservative side, do this with Nancy Pelosi. Or if you're on the far liberal side, do it with Nancy Pelosi. See, finally, Trump supporters and Bernie supporters can agree. We all hate Nancy Pelosi. All right. Do it with and if you love Nancy Pelosi, do this with Trump. So let that difficult person, that difficult fact, just fill your mind and your body on the cushion and see what comes up. Just go in there fearlessly, diving into your own personal wreck. There could be fear for yourself or for others. There could be anxiety. There could be rage. And let yourself feel these feelings and just see what they are and what's going on right now, and can I be with it? Right? What's going on right now, and can I be with it? Can I bring in the enormity of the catastrophe or the anger or the frustration? And one thing that's really nice about the president is there's always something new. So you can think about Andrew Jackson now, who knew that was going to be, right? So there's always something new. Your practice stays fresh. And again, it's nonpartisan, right? There are a lot of folks, so I'm friends with a number of more conservative folks, Republicans, I'm not actually friends with too many Trump supporters or any, but I am friends with several Republicans who are kind of never Trumpers. And could you imagine if he was ruining your political party? Like destroying all of the principles that you've worked, the Republican Party is kind of torn apart already, and here he is like just junking the thing. So this works if you're a Republican, right? To really sit with the anger or the loss and just explore. There's a difference between, actually I think Terry put it really well, there's a difference between thoughts and thinking. So like it's not an invitation to sit on the cushion and just rehash what you just read in Mother Jones, right? It's an opportunity to just have that little thought come in and just see how you're feeling around it. The meditator understands the consciousness with desire as consciousness with desire, without desire as without desire. And the point of this practice is that it's practice, right? By enabling, when you're sitting in a safe space on the cushion, by building that resilience and that ability to coexist with these very difficult emotions. So maybe it'll come up again and you can be tested. So now you're in a conversation with a relative with whom you disagree. And there's that emotion. And you can just sort of, I'm feeling really angry right now. I won't reply all on this email. Yeah. Just like a little bit of practice at a time. My friend Dan Harris's best-selling book called 10% Happier, that is such a good title, right? We don't have to get to be 100%. 10%. Can I be 10% less combative? Can I be 10% more effective? Can I be 10% more resilient? Can I be 10% happier? You can't will that to happen, but just again and again, allow on the cushion. I wrote this this is a quote from a Tricycle article. On the cushion, let your mind, body, heart system sink into the reality of American proto-fascism, of environmental devastation, of no health care for the poor. Don't stay in this mental swamp for hours, but do stay there for a few minutes. That's the invitation. See if that works for you in practice. It's also good if you're feeling sleepy, because you won't be. So a third practice, a third way of building this kind of resiliency that can then help us in whatever social justice work we're doing, whatever resistance work we're doing, wherever we find ourselves on the spectrum. And again, I'm sort of assuming that a UU Buddhist group tends to be on the left side of the political spectrum, so that's why I'm saying we a lot. Hopefully I'm right, but if I'm wrong, it's not specific to having a particular view, right? So a third practice to take on is what some of you may know of as metta practice or loving kindness practice. So in loving kindness practice, the fun way to do it is you're sitting and you decide I'm going to do loving kindness practice, and you think of someone or something for whom it's easy to feel loving kindness. It's fun to do this for pets, actually, for example. So less stories about the pets than about your partner or parent. So, and you just imagine this person or being, and you just say over and over again, may you be happy, or may you be free from suffering, or people have different phrases that they like to use. And it's not the efficacy of prayer. It's not a belief that this is going to make them happy. It's just building loving kindness within yourself. What's it like to see if the Beatles were right? If the love you take is equal to the love you make. Turns out they were right, in my experience. A variation on the basic loving kindness practice is to change the types of people for whom you're doing the practice. So you might start with an easy person, the friend, You might move to a benefactor, somebody who's helped you in life. Or you might move to a neutral person, which is really fun. So people often pick someone they see, like let's say a store clerk or someone like that, and then you'll go see that store clerk, and they don't know that and don't tell them that you've been meditating on them, and also the difficult person. The difficult person might be someone with whom we're in a relationship that we don't want to just escape from, but geez, their political views are just odious, or if we don't have that person in our lives directly, there's a lot of post-election, post-mortem stuff about how like the Democrats didn't get the white working class, and if we could only feel their pain better, and so on and so forth. And I'm not going to go down that particular sidetrack into a rabbit hole, but there's some truth to that. There's a lot of us-them language in the way I've presented what I've had to say already. There's a lot of, I'm not like them, or they did this, and I'm not equating that kind of us-theming with the us-theming that the government itself is doing by remilitarizing communities of color, police communities of color. Like, that's a lot worse, but there's some commonality. What's it like to really actually really wish someone well, who we disagree with? They want what we want. They want happiness, they want security, they want safety, they want what they think of as peace. Is it possible to just do that, try that practice? The metta for a Trump supporter, the metta for Trump himself. Maybe not Trump himself. So I think here, again, Thich Nhat Hanh, who I mentioned before, the Vietnamese monk, was really helpful. That if we think that the great evils of the world were done by evil people who we have nothing to do with, we've really missed the point. Right? The point is that from whether it's horrible or miserable, great evil or just mundane annoyance, it was done by us. It was done by people like us with the same faculties of mind that we have, that I have. Right? And not the same cultural position necessarily as I have, right, as a white male living in America, but right, I don't want to say that everybody's in the same position and everybody, they're different cultural positions, but the factors of mind are present. Can I actually feel the fear and the just, not dehumanize, but humanize? And again, not for their sake. I'm not doing it so that for somebody else's. I'm doing it for my own. Can I actually be more effective? Can I better see when it's worth having an argument and when it's not? When an action is a resistance action is something that can make a difference or not? How to relate skillfully to people who I'm in relationship with, of one kind or another. Let's give that a shot. Metta for Trump supporters, or just people in our lives with whom we disagree. And again, if it's easier, the people on the left are also very divided right now. So just exploring that possibility. All of this culminates and leads to what I think is this fourth practice, which I want to spend the last 3-4 minutes on, which has to do with the great art of segmentation. A lot of times in spiritual communities, we hear a lot about integration. I want to integrate my spiritual life and my political life. I want to integrate my personal life. And for me, I've worked with that just personally on a personal level for 25 years, right? So I have these two careers where there's the Dharma teacher person and the political pundit person. And I have a lot of bifurcation. And I've actually come to really appreciate the opposite of integration. What I call sabra practice. Sabra is it's a nickname for Israelis. It's also a cactus in the Middle East. It's really prickly on the outside, but juicy and flowing on the inside. And I want to suggest that one way of developing resiliency, balancing our retreat or resist in the current political moment, our current social moment, is actually about building sabra practice, building that distinction between the outer and the inner. The outside can be sometimes tough, right? We're not messing around. The outside can be cold and calculating. The outside can also look at facts rather than get super carried away by this kind of hyperbole or that kind of hyperbole. Clickbait on the left is only slightly better, I think, than the fake news clickbait on the right. Right? Cold, calculating, tactical, ruthless, not stopping, not sharing my deepest fears with people with whom I'm in some kind of a struggle. Picking and choosing which actions I want to do, not because they may feel better necessarily. It feels great to sign an online petition, but what's the theory of change behind that online petition? Is there a theory of change? for the climate march, let's say, that just happened, there's a theory of change, right? It's still a march, it's a demonstration, it's not a sort of direct action. But the idea behind that kind of march, all those kinds of marches, is we need to build a sort of mass movement. People need to get energized. It's really preaching to the choir, right? We want to get people energized who we already agree with. Climate marches don't persuade a lot of people, a lot of climate deniers. That's not what they're for, right? But if there was really a large sense of a large movement, the Women's March, best example so far this year, that like, no, here's a constituency. This is like a real force to be reckoned with, right? So that's a theory of change. I don't know, random clicktivism, slacktivism, maybe, but maybe not, right? Ruthless, calculating, cold, picking the battles based on what works, right? And you can actually practice on during this time, like take it out on the road. As you get in a conversation, keep doing your practice and seeing what's up in my mind, what's going on, and can I be with it? That's on the outside. On the inside, I want to say, as what some people call libtards, and I use that word advisedly because that stigmatizes a lot of people, that I am proud to be a libtard who feels his feelings, who questions the masculine nature of what men are supposed to be like and just be tough all the time, who actually is willing to be brokenhearted at the news. I'm proud to be a snowflake internally, right? Snowflakes melt. Melting is beautiful. Melting is how solids turn into liquids and mix with each other instead of stay separate like rocks. Being a snowflake is a delightful privilege. I'm very grateful that I'm a snowflake. I'm not going to show that to the folks who want to call me a snowflake. I'm going to fight back. I'm going to punch back. And if you read my stuff in the Daily Beast, you'd be surprised that it's the same person who's even talking here. Like, how dare you write all of these? How can you be a spiritual person, somebody once told me recently, and still write this column against Trump, or this column about this, or this column about that? Well, skillful means for skillful ends and different contexts. That's what I mean by the art of segmentation. I think, since the election in particular, I've noticed in progressive communities, kind of we're going through like the cycles of grief, over and over again. And each day or each hour, I'm at a different stage on this. Sometimes it's a denial day. Those are nice. Most of the time, I spend time in bargaining. Like, oh, it's not so bad. Like, yeah, all right, here's the 10. I actually made a list. It was very helpful for me. And take this if you like. Feel free to do this. The list between the things about the government that I think are terrible, but that don't keep me awake at night. And then like the 10 things that are just the worst that I can't possibly. That was super helpful for me, actually, right? And then when it's on the bottom half, so like for just, so I don't want to get into specifics, which issues made it onto the bottom half or whatever. But like the issues that were on like I hate this, but it doesn't keep me awake at night, I actually did stop paying it that much attention to, right? I just focused on, well, here's like the 10, like remilitarization of the police for me is on the top half of that. And so that, like, all right, I'm gonna spend a lot of energy on that, other ones. So that's bargaining, right? Oh, it's not so bad, or there's, plenty of time spent in anger, a lot of time spent in sadness, and like once in a while, a moment of acceptance, like clarity. But when somebody dies, my mother died 2 years ago, and where I wrote the book, The Gate of Tears, kind of right in that grieving period. When somebody dies, they don't keep dying, right? You don't keep getting re-injured again and again and again and again with each new news cycle. So in a way, it's actually worse. It's like we cycle through the stages of grief, but they keep recycling. They keep actually right? And that's it. There's a lot of pain. And so again, it's that retreat or resist piece. It's not that there's two separate pieces that we have to be doing, right? There's that outward facing work of showing up as an ally for folks who are more vulnerable as often as possible and as effectively as possible. And there is the inner work, right? There is that work of being soft and juicy and tender on the inside. And I'm going to try my best not to let the government, of all things, steal that part, right, from me. And then I will put on the other hat at the drop of a hat, in the moment's notice, and be right out there. And there's a certain freedom in that. There's a certain kind of joy, even, in being able to have the safe space of my community where I come back to, and the people who I love and who I care about and who I can connect with and who I can share with. That is so important. And it's like the two halves really feed one another. Like, I think that would feel really indulgent to me and irresponsible without the part that's out there metaphorically in the streets, or literally in the streets. And yet conversely, to only have the outside to me would feel really tough and soul-killing. And I'm not interested really in a certain way. You see what I mean by not integrating like it's integrated in a certain way. It's two halves of the whole or whatever. But it's not, I'm not trying to blend the two. I'm not trying to be the same person that out on the street as I am on the meditation cushion or on the sofa with my lover. Like I'm not trying to integrate that. So I started with a fake Jewish joke from a fake Hasidic context. I'll end with an actual one. And it's just a really helpful phrase that was made popular by a Hasidic rabbi in the 19th century named Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. He didn't originate it, but he made it popular. It was actually from the Talmud, from the even earlier 2nd century Ethics of the Fathers, that it's not incumbent upon you to finish the work, but you're also not free to desist from it. And I found many, many times over the last 100 days that bit of wisdom to be real encouragement. That of course we want to be sort of goal-oriented and we want to lessen the suffering of everybody in the world, especially the most vulnerable. But it's not on us, it's not on me, it's not on us to finish that work. But it is on us, it is incumbent on us not to desist from it. So, thank you. What's nice about being in Buddhist meditating spaces is that there are no more awkward silences, right? So nobody asks a question, I can just practice.
Just a comment, I really liked your segmentation idea, but it seems like that is a way to integrate, because you're separating in order to integrate, which is a paradox, but it's a nice paradox.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's a little, it's like separating but integrating, and there is a little bit of that, the yin and the yang piece, where the pieces kind of fit together, the two puzzle pieces. And oh, man, I was trying not to integrate, and now I've gone and integrated. Yeah, thank you.
Define resistance.
Yeah, so how to define resistance. At the risk of sounding really touchy-feely about it, I think we're going to have different definitions of resistance. For me, there are a lot of different forms of resistance. So I have a lot of friends who are artists, and for them, being artistically engaged and doing their artwork in a serious way is a form of resistance. And I think that's valid. It's building a counterculture. It's building, we are, right, the forces of light are going to win this, right? I actually, just a couple of weeks after the election, I was actually teaching a 7-day silent meditation retreat right after the election, which was an interesting thing. And right after that, I was at a movie, actually, and there was a preview for that recent Pixar film, Moana, right? So, Moana, very much a 21st century heroine, right? Woman of color, right? There was a sort of, it was Hollywoodized and kind of watered down, obviously, turned into capitalism, but still, indigenous woman of color fighting against, I was kind of into it, right? Like this, and it really occurred to me, like, Moana is going to win, right? Like, no matter what, no matter how many innocent people are deported, right? The demographics are what they are. I mean, this is the last gasp of a certain kind of white supremacy. And so I think given that, a lot of resistance is about helping folks survive, right? Just over dinner, I realized, Terry and I were talking, and I realized that I think how many of us even remembered today, for example, that travel ban on various countries is in effect, like the flight, you can't come in on a plane from various countries, that's still happening, right? So a lot of it is helping people survive. A lot of it is in-your-face actions and resistance. A lot of it is maintaining our dissenting and dissonant selves. and resisting the tide to, and there is also that resisting this story that I've seen myself, telling myself many times that we're living in Trump's America, and we're not. We're not. I mean, all right, so obviously we know that Hillary Clinton won by 3 million votes, okay? But even within, this is a little bit of the outside piece, even within the Trump half, roughly half, right? Remember, there were 3 major pieces of the Republican coalition, right? There's sort of the wealthy elites, the plutocrats, pro-business types, and also principled folks who are just, less government regulation, things like that, conservatives of sincere conservatism. Evangelicals, which were by far, religious conservatives was by far the largest bloc that put Trump in office. And the Trump voters, the deplorables, the deplorables are the smallest of those 3, right? They're there. There's tens of millions of people who have these ideas, or these beliefs, but right. And just remembering that we're not living in that America, right? I mean, that religious conservatives made a deal, and they got paid back. They got a religious conservative on the Supreme Court. I used to clerk for Judge Garland, so I'm personally connected to that story also, right? They got a hardcore religious conservative on the court. That's just on the Supreme Court, but there are going to be dozens of federal judges. They got a hardcore religious conservative running the Department of Education. They wanted that. So they made a deal. They got what they got. They're not there to endorse every aspect of the worst of the Trump coalition. So anyway, that's just one example of resisting the story that I've seen myself, like what happened to my country. And also the converse of that. A lot of folks, non-white friends of mine, have actually challenged me on the other side. Like, what do you mean, like, this isn't your country? Like, this has been your country. Like, you may not have been woke to the fact that this is your country, but like, you're so surprised, they're saying to me, like, you're so surprised that like, so many people voted for like a race-baiting, white supremacist, like, well, you shouldn't be that surprised. So that's been a real awekening kind of for me, resisting that myth that, I never bought into the whole post-racial, like, oh, Obama, America, like we're all done now. But I clearly did buy into that some amount, a little bit, not being aware that that's what I was buying into. And so that's been, and old-fashioned resistance of engaged politics working on the inside as well, flipping districts and adopting, if you're in a liberal congressional district, adopting a not liberal district and doing work on voter registration. One of the untold stories, I wrote, I think, a dozen articles on voter suppression in 2016. It's one of the untold stories. I actually went and did the math afterwards. If it weren't for the voter suppression in a couple of key states, the election would have swung the other way. So there's an issue that we can resist on in a very direct way, registering people. If folks are willing to get IDs, which now there are plenty of good reasons not to do that, and you can't fight the voter suppression law, then helping people work through the voter suppression law, dispelling the myths. Just up in Minneapolis, St. Paul, there were billboards put up in majority black neighborhoods, like, if you be careful when you vote. If you have any outstanding warrants or tickets or whatever, you could get in trouble. And lies. I think that weren't even totally not true. Ironically, now some of them are true. Now, if you show up to pay your traffic ticket and you've got someone undocumented in your family, now you actually are exposing yourself. So it's harder to do that kind of resistance. But I have friends in LA who are putting their bodies in around undocumented agricultural workers. ICE was raiding the pickup points where people who were day laborers would get picked up to go. And so people were actually going there. So I think there's a lot of forms of that. I'll just try to be controversial and say something we don't all agree with. I don't think spiritual practice in itself is resistance. I think it's part of resistance. I think it's an aid to what I think of as resistance. But I don't have a mystical view that if enough people were meditating, that itself would bring world peace. And I think I've seen firsthand in myself, in my students, in friends, that anything can be turned into what Trungpa Rinpoche called spiritual materialism. I meditate, therefore I'm good, and I'm taken care of. And so, It does have to, and it's funny, even in the more monastic version that I started out with in the beginning, like detached from the world, even there, the notion is that you're contributing one more person, one more enlightened person, you're contributing to overall fewer people feeling suffering, and fewer people experiencing less suffering in the world. So that's been there, and that's true in every spiritual tradition that I'm aware of, that we don't practice for ourselves, but we practice for the world in which we find ourselves. Long answer, but a great question. Yeah.
I like your phrase, the search for a usable past. Are you tying that in with resistance?
Oh, interesting. A search for a usable past. So I didn't invent that term. It's an academic term that's been really, I think, really helpful, actually, because there's kind of this. The opposite of that is some fake kind of fundamentalist idea that it's actually the search for authenticity, that I'm in some unbroken lineage and whatever that goes way back into this thing, and that's what's good. No, I think I'm searching for a usable past, and fully aware that the unadulterated past would not be usable. In Buddhist land, there's a great Rita Gross's book, Buddhism After Patriarchy. It's a great book to look at, and thinking about also how communities are structured today. For insider baseball people in the Buddhist world, there's actually a really controversial document that just got leaked. It was from the International Insight Meditation Teachers, and it was like the laundry list of like 75 ways in which patriarchy manifests in our contemporary Dharma communities. Great. It's like a really good list. And you can find it, just Google that phrase and you'll find it. It's not about one institution, like this one place has all these, it's like, here's what I think was created by women only. So not, feminist allies or whatever. It's just, here's the way that in which I've experienced patriarchy in my institutions. But for me, so usable past and resistance, I think the American experiment is about that, right? So, the idolatry of the founding fathers, half of whom were slaveholders, that's not a usable past, right? But I'm not going to not quote the good parts of the Federalist Papers or the highest achievements of the founders. It's just going to be a different kind of engagement, right? That's understanding, the best of America is pretty good, actually. We just may not live up to it most of the time. And we could have an interesting debate. Do we live up to it 1% of the time? Or, 10% of the time, 50%? Probably not 50%. But what percentage of the time does this country live up to its greatest ideals, right? We could argue about that. But the ideals, a lot of them are really good. Not all, but most. Well, some. So that's the usable past to me when it comes to resistance. I could say that the authentic America was the America of the Gilded Age, in which, rapacious hyper-capitalism, unparalleled until the present day, and now it is paralleled. I could say that's the American dream. Or I could say, like President Trump just said, that, gosh, that Civil War, why couldn't they have worked that out? Has anyone paused to think about what that meant? I think we were focused on the Andrew Jackson anachronism that he lived, and that Andrew Jackson was a slaveholder, right? But what would it mean to have worked it? We could have just worked it out somehow, like some slavery, but not as much slavery. It's an outrageous, it was just another Trumpism, but just right? So that's not the usable past, right? So that's where I think it's having that. It's almost like what Bertolt Brecht called complex seeing, where I see the whole frame and as much as I can, and yet I also can see the story inside the frame and be moved by it and take the pieces from it that are usable, and be full and admit, it's quite silly, I think, when liberals and conservatives argue about what the founders thought about X or Y or Z. First of all, that's just not the conversation we should even be having. But even if it is, we can't. They thought different things. They're a bunch of guys. And even for a bunch of white propertied men, they still had a diversity of opinion. And so we're not going to get that answer. So what's the usable past?
As we deal with our own personal top 10 of horrible things, and we try and determine how we can deal with it, phrase, why does that not lead us to just being inured to these bad things and just accepting the new normal, whatever it is?
Yeah, so how can we coexist with the bad things without being inured to them and normalizing them? This sounds like a little bit of a witty, like I'm blowing it. Try it. But that's my actual response. It doesn't, it just doesn't, it hasn't worked, it doesn't really work that way, I find. Because when we're with it, we're really with it, right? You know, the getting normal, the normalization issue, I mean, in a certain way, we do want a certain kind of normalization, which means we want to see that this is happening and not deny that this is happening. That's not what you mean by, that's not what we mean by normalization, but we do want that. But it just doesn't work that way. So, I mean, I'll just use this latest trivial example about could we have worked it out on the Civil War? Like, you know, I can sit with that. I do the inventory of how I feel with it, how I feel about it, and do the list. And at the end of that process, it's definitely still not normal. You know, or another example, I have friends who are on documented friends who are on various visas, whether they're H-1Bs or, you know, other kinds of visa statuses that are being revoked, which is ludicrously stupid from a hardcore conservative economic perspective. Like, we don't have to be a bleeding heart liberal and care about these people. We could just care about big business, and it's still ludicrously stupid. So, you know, these are people, these are friends. I mean, these are directly, you know, friends of mine, and they're worried, and they should be worried. And so for me, I do find it useful to just really inhabit what's, you know, to like sit with that. And just you know, that's not even as bad as some other things, but we don't need to play the oppression Olympics. That's pretty bad, right? So yeah, that's bad, and just sit with it. I guess, I don't know if I can give you a conceptual answer, but my practical answer is it doesn't do it. It actually allows me to see more of the horror of those subjects. Yeah. All right, last one.
So after the election and inauguration, our Sangha talked about, well, if Trump came to our Sangha, what would we do? Would we accept him as...
This is the hugest Sangha.
Yeah.
Terry, great guy, best guy. I got the best meditations.
Would we resist that and say, you don't adhere to the precepts that we've acknowledged we're trying to get towards, even if all of us aren't there yet, and we won't allow you into this space? So I guess I'm still trying to work through the resistance and retreat. Like, I don't know, in that part, are we saying, all right, come in, and we're going to tell you all the reasons why you're wrong. And come join us. Come see.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll switch it from Trump to a Trump supporter. Like, let's just say somebody wearing a MAGA hat, you know, Make America Great Again hat. Because that's an easy way to just telegraph a bunch of ideas without personalizing. You know, I mean, for me, look, I mean, we talked, you know, a little bit about just this talk, you know, like, because you know, one of the great, I think, ally activist questions is to always ask, who is the we? You know, when we're saying we, like, who's in that we and who's not in that we, who's assumed to be excluded from that we, who's other. And so is the we only people who have certain political views? Terry basically said yes, so I, but, you know, I think what's interesting about the question for me is that the other person would have to be proactive in wearing the hat to come into the space, right? Otherwise, how would I know, right? How would I judge? And I'm a pretty judgy person, you know, I've noticed over my years of meditation. You know, someone comes in wearing certain clothes, and I've like reached some view about, you know, what I think they think, or, you know, I'm trying to think, you know, looking out at all of you, like, who's the person who really doesn't buy this or something. I'm not looking at anyone right now. I don't want to minimize, definitely don't want to minimize any of that. But like the direct, so if somebody were to come to me and say, I feel really unsafe that somebody's wearing this Bush Cheney hat, I would say, well, let's see if we can, you know, let's see if we can work with that. Like, I honor that feeling. I'm not minimizing it, not dismissing it. It's like, is there a way that we can coexist with that feeling of, you know, you will not be physically unsafe, right? The community is here with you. But I think it is different when it's a Trump hat, because it's like targeting people who are in the we in a certain way. Yeah.
I was just going to say that the MAGA or MAWA, Make America White Again, to me, it's the same as someone wearing a Confederate flag on their shirt.
Right.
I mean, it's just a milder way of saying,
Right. Yeah, I think.
you brown people don't belong here, even though this country was inhabited.
Right.
And massacred brown people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think. Yeah, thank you for that. And so I think I don't know if I have a neat answer. You know, when someone comes in, let's take that interpretation, just run with it just for a moment. Like if somebody's coming in, it's almost as if they're saying that to you, to people in the room who are part of the community. So it's not, now maybe I'm just, again, with my white privilege, not really getting the evil of Bush Cheney, but at least my memory from 10 years ago is that the threat is there, but it was diffuse in a certain way, as opposed to like, and so I think it's a tough question. I don't think I have an easy answer for it. I do think it's been really helpful. Again, I'm not friends with a lot of religious conservatives, but I read a lot of religious conservative press because I write on religion a lot for the Daily Beast. I think it is really interesting to kind of see where that community's at. There are a lot of different points of view, and obviously they don't care what some gay guy thinks. So, but it's interesting for me to learn, about these profound concerns. And a lot of the profound concerns of religious conservatives are concerns which we have also about vulgarization of our society, about exploitation of women, right? About the kind of overt sexualization, sexual violence. They're just prescriptions are really, really different. So that's why we should have the Handmaid's Tale and all. So it's a very different prescription, but there can be something really helpful about that piece. And so that I would actually be interested in exploring what that might look like, about having a space where assumed progressive UUs and assumed conservative evangelicals actually do that. Unfortunately, most UUs are too heretical to sit. You guys are marked. you can't do it. You're treif. That's the opposite of kosher. But so I think it's a really fascinating, nuanced question. If somebody were to come in without the hat, but I knew that they were a Trump supporter, then actually I really would like them to sit. And I'd not hear this talk, because this talk wasn't really meant for, I would give a different talk. But the practice itself, I was going to say if we believe in the practice, but that's too much faith. Just if we try the practice for a while, and we're meditating for a while, and we see its effects on opening our hearts, then we have to feel like encouraged that could open hearts, even hearts that seem closed, or that are open, but are open in a very different direction from mine, then going in a different direction, or the heart is open, but the mind is somewhere different from mine. And so if there weren't that provocation, and there weren't that marker, and there weren't this talk, I'd love to think that there's a space for opening.